Protests against police brutality continue in dozens of American cities, a week after the killing of unarmed African-American George Floyd. President Trump says he wants to obtain justice.
All Americans were rightly sickened and revolted by the brutal death of George Floyd. My administration is fully committed that for George and his family, justice will be served. He will not have died in vain.
In Minneapolis, the victim's brother tells demonstrators that violence would not bring the changes the black community deserved.
My family is a peaceful family. My family is God-fearing. Let's do this another way. Let's stop thinking that our voice don't matter.
That's right.
And vote.
Thousands of heavily armed soldiers to be deployed in the US. President Trump moves to stop the rioting following the death of George Floyd. President Trump has announced he's taking immediate action to stop the rioting and looting that has swept the US. It was triggered by the death of African-American man George Floyd while in police custody in Minneapolis last week.
In a televised address at the White House overnight, Mr. Trump said he was deploying thousands of heavily armed soldiers and police in Washington and that an overnight curfew would be strictly enforced. He also threatened to send in the military if governors failed to take action to quell the violence. Here's our correspondent in Los Angeles, Sophie Long.
More than a week after George Floyd became the latest African-American to needlessly lose his life at the hands of a white police officer, the pain is still palpable. Nowhere more so than here, the street in Minneapolis where he died. His brother came to the makeshift memorial and made a plea for peace.
If I'm not over here messing up my community, come on. Then what are y'all doing? What are y'all doing? Y'all doing nothing. Because that's not going to bring my brother back at all.
A second post-mortem examination found George Floyd died from asphyxiation, and it was homicide. Delivering the findings, his family's lawyer urged people to stand with them peacefully. Meanwhile, crowds gathered for a seventh night of protests. Thousands spilled onto the streets in cities from the West Coast to the East, demanding an end to racial injustice. In the capital, protesters were forced away from the White House by police, firing canisters of tear gas, so the president could tell state governors, if you don't stop this, I will.
Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace.
To do so would involve wielding extraordinary federal authority.
President Trump declared himself an ally of legitimate protesters like these here in Los Angeles. But some fear his threat to use an antiquated act to deploy military personnel across America's cities could spark more anger and potentially further escalate an already increasingly tense situation.
On the streets of Los Angeles, the looting started before sunset, and America braced itself for another difficult and dangerous night. Sophie Long, BBC News, Los Angeles.
Well, let's find out how that night is going, shall we? We can speak now to our North America correspondent, Peter Bowes, who's also in Los Angeles for us. Peter, not just in LA, but across the states tonight. How's it looking?
It's looking a lot better, John, than it has for the last few days. There's still been trouble in some places. We've just been hearing in Los Angeles. I was struck here in this city by the number of people that were just being lined up against walls in the streets, handcuffed as soon as the curfew came into effect, the dusk to dawn curfew that we've had here for now 2 days in a row. We've heard similar stories from New York City, where there's been some looting, also some trouble in Washington, but not, thankfully, on the scale that we saw, John, over the weekend.
So the president's words at the White House last night, has that helped to quell things, or is there a risk that that could inflame things yet further?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of concern that over the next few days it could be a risky strategy. It's certainly on the basis of the last few hours doesn't seem to have encouraged more people to go out onto the streets. But what the president didn't address during his speech from the White House in the Rose Garden was the issue, the very issue about racial that is concerning so many people. It was purely about law and order, indeed describing himself as the law and order president and laying down that challenge to state governors to essentially to clear the streets and sort out the situation, otherwise he will send in the military.